The black metal scene is as famous for its controversies as it is for its music. It is full of musicians who have done real harm to real people, everything from arson and property destruction to assault and murder. All of the genre's most popular bands have been involved in numerous controversies over the years and based a lot of their following off of that. However, in a sea of mayhem and Burzum clones, one man stands out. Not for committing any extreme violence to others, but for doing extraordinary harm to himself, time and time again ruining his own mind, body, and career. This is the tragic story of Grausamkeit, from his years living in complete obscurity to becoming an international sensation. Andreas Bettinger was born on the 1st of August 1980 in Saarland, Germany. Both of his parents were heroin addicts. While he was still a child, he was taken away from them and adopted by a local priest. He became fascinated with music very early on. He started learning piano when he was somewhere between 8 and 10 years old, with his earliest inspirations coming from classical music. He preferred what he refers to as melancholical, proud, and majestic music, an influence that can be seen in most of his later black metal work. As he got slightly older, his taste would shift, with Andreas later citing Whiplash by Billy Idol and Metallica's Master of Puppets as his first CDs. He would go on to become a big fan of both of them. He first learned about black metal from the German Rock Hard magazine, through their coverage of the emerging Scandinavian black metal scene. Black metal quickly took over his life, becoming the only music he listened to and the only music he was interested in playing. He picked up guitar and drums. However, even decades later, Andreas would state that he considers himself an amateur with both of those instruments, with the only instrument he feels fully confident with being the one he received professional training in, piano. At only 12 years old, he formed his first one-man project, titled Anal Oral. It's unclear whether he actually created any music as Anal Oral, as there are no known recordings of it to this day. The first project he was active with came shortly after, a band called Blaspheming in which he was a drummer and a second vocalist. They released a handful of demos, all of them being noisy, lo-fi black metal. Andreas would later say that his main inspiration was the Finnish band B.S.o.D, with Bettinger specifically citing their raw and primal approach to music as an influence. Following that, he formed the band Musical Ars Composition with Han Kyu Choi. They had one split release, it also consisting of noisy, fast and abrasive black metal. This is when he first started going under the alias of B.S.o.D, short for Black Son of Darkness. Musical Ars Composition did not last long, but B.S.o.D is a pseudonym that Andreas uses to this day. He went through a few other bands before deciding to start a solo project again in 1994. At only 14 years old, Andreas created Grausamkeit, his most well-known and by far his most prolific project. Andreas started making a lot of music under the Grausamkeit umbrella. Unlike his previous work, which remained fully within the realm of black metal, Grausamkeit combined his love for classical music with his love for metal. It is a mix of melancholic keyboard melodies and harsh, noisy black metal, alternating between the two in a single song and often playing both simultaneously. This is topped off by his abrasive, screechy vocals. The final result is a combination of black metal and dungeon synth, before the term dungeon synth was even brought into popularity by Varg Vikernes. Even though Varg hadn't started making dungeon synth by this point, Andreas cites Burzum as one of his main inspirations in interviews, presumably due to Burzum's heavy use of synths. Andreas started producing tapes of his demos himself, under the one-man label Fucking Armageddon Productions. Due to the nature of having to produce and distribute the tapes by hand, only a very small quantity of his demos was made initially. His first demo, Black Thorns of Evil, ended up with only 5 released copies. His second, Born Under Occult Intentions, wasn't much better, with Andreas releasing 10 copies this time around. The inability to release music on a mass scale and the fact that his work wasn't being noticed did not seem to discourage Andreas. Despite everything, he kept working hard on his music and creating demo after demo. But at 15, his life would change forever. He started experimenting with drugs. He recalls in an interview decades later that his second ever experience with drugs came in the form of heroin. Andreas was instantly hooked, and heroin would go on to become as big of a part of his life as his music. He started working as a small-time drug dealer, only dealing enough to cover his living expenses and his own drug use. And in the late 90s, Andreas met Sandra, a fellow heroin addict 1 year older than him. This encounter would result in the most musically productive period of his life. Andreas and Sandra started dating and soon got married, with Sandra changing her name to Sandra Bettinger. The two of them moved into a 3-bedroom apartment together. One of the bedrooms was dedicated to a makeshift home studio, which consisted of a 4-track tape recorder, a keyboard, and a guitar. A lot of the drumming on the Grausamkeit demos does not come from real drums. Rather, they're sampled drums played on a keyboard. Andreas would spend over 10 hours each day in the studio, doing drugs and listening to Norwegian black metal until inspiration struck. The period of 1995 to 2002 was one of hyper-productivity for Andreas. With Grausamkeit alone, he released 18 demos, 3 albums, and 3 splits. He recorded Fucking Goat Hornets, Stardust, Angel Destruction, and Pink Green 666 in the Pagan Winter Studio. Everything else was recorded in his apartment, a place he referred to as the Fucking Armageddon Studio. He released music under 40 different projects in which he was the only member while living at the apartment. One of these was arguably his second most popular project, Trollheim. In addition to that, he was a part of 10 other bands. Sandra was also a musician and helped with some of these, under the alias of Melsa. Melsa had her own projects too, most notably Morigana, a black metal project, and Blod Besvimelse, a combination of black metal and dungeon synth. While Melsa was the face of Blod Besvimelse, Andreas worked on the project extensively, providing melodies, lyrics, and helping with the recording of the music. Despite Andreas and Sandra putting in all of this work though, no one else was really aware of their music. All of their demos were still handmade under Fucking Armageddon Productions and released in extremely limited quantities. Furthermore, it's worth noting how isolated Andreas and Sandra's creative process was. The black metal scene of the time relied on having a strong community of like-minded musicians. All of the notable bands of the 90s knew each other, or had at least interacted at some point. Even if they didn't live in the same country, they frequently wrote to each other, something that became a trademark of the Scandinavian scene. Black metal was far from mainstream, and labels weren't lining up to sign black metal bands. So to ensure that their friends were able to keep creating and reach any success, the scene relied on musicians helping each other out. Everything from getting the music recorded to distributing it and marketing it was a community effort, which is why so many early black metal artists have credits as session musicians with other bands, and most of them have given interviews in the past attempting to spread word of their friends' new releases. In contrast to that, Andreas and Sandra were completely disconnected from any wider black metal community. They spent all of their time locked in the apartment, getting high on heroin and recording music for only themselves to hear. Most of the other bands Andreas played in were from his youth, when he was first starting out as a musician. As the years passed, he spent more and more time making music only by himself and with Sandra. He was making music purely out of a desire to make music. He made no attempts to get his music out there, and it was arguably never meant to be known. But unsurprisingly, his lifestyle wasn't good for him in the long term. He was unemployed, with the closest thing to work being his side hustle as a drug dealer, and completely obsessed with two things: music and drugs. It is only natural that he would plunge deeper and deeper into his heroin addiction until it ruined him. As Andreas' addiction worsened, it bled into his musical output. In 1999, he started another project, bluntly titled Heroin Makes Happy. He released a number of demos and splits under the project, with it now existing as one of Andreas' more popular works. It stands as very distinct from Grausamkeit, abandoning any trace of black metal. It is a mix of darkwave and dungeon synth, with Andreas' screechy vocals on top of it. The music unashamedly glamorizes heroin use, with release titles such as It Makes Really Happy, Nothing Is Better Than, It's Not Too Late to Say Yes to H, and Heroin Is My Queen. The cover of Heroin Is My Queen grimly portrays Sandra as she appears to be overdosing on the substance. Andreas' interviews aren't much different. In his very few interviews, he calls himself a heroin advocate and states that he believes that everyone in the black metal and death metal scene needs to try heroin. Heroin would soon take music away from Andreas for good, as he was imprisoned in the winter of 2003 for a drug offense. He would end up spending most of the remainder of the 2000s and the 2010s in prison. Andreas was in prison between the winter of 2003 and the autumn of 2004, then again from the winter of 2004 until the autumn of 2005, and again between the summer of 2006 and some point in 2012. In prison, he continued playing music, briefly becoming a part of a B.S.o.D tribute band as well as a Hells Angels band called 8-1. After getting out of prison in 2012, his relationship with Sandra worsened. The two would end up getting a divorce sometime between July and September of 2013, presumably due to Andreas spending most of the previous decade behind bars. Only a few months later, in November of 2013, Sandra would pass away from an overdose, with some speculating that the overdose may have been an intentional suicide attempt. Sandra's death did not result in Andreas changing his ways whatsoever. He went back to prison in 2014, getting out in September of 2015 only to go back to prison again in 2016. He was released on the 20th of March 2019, that being Andreas' last known prison stay. At this point in time, he managed to accumulate an insane 147 offenses on his police record. One was for violence, one for incitement of hatred for the time he drew a Wolfsangel on a wall inspired by Burzum, with the remaining 145 offenses all being drug-related. Around 2016, the German label Narbentage Produktionen managed to get the rights to the Grausamkeit demos recorded in Andreas's apartment nearly 2 decades earlier. They began giving them wider releases. The fact that they were now publicly available, online no less, meant that the wider black metal community became acquainted with Andreas's music for the first time. While he was still very underground, he started amassing fans. However, he was still imprisoned while all of this was happening. Upon his release in 2019, a period of silence followed. A lot of different theories started floating around. Some believed him to be dead. Some thought that he had returned to prison again shortly after being released. Some thought that he might have finally decided to go to rehab now that his music was taking off. While the status of his heroin addiction is still a mystery, Andreas was definitely alive and free. It wouldn't take long for him to go back to making music, at a pace rivaling his apartment studio days. He dropped release after release as Grausamkeit. He started entirely new projects, some of them being titled Pure Evil and Weltentot. Somewhat ominously, he released a new EP under Heroin Makes Happy only last year, titled Klatschmon Segen or Poppy Blessing. After spending decades making music in complete obscurity, his career was about to change overnight, due to, of all things, TikTok. In the last couple of years, the re-releases of his old demos by Narbentage started getting traction on the app. Thousands and thousands of new fans began flooding to Grausamkeit, with Pink Green 666 especially getting a lot of attention. As I'm making this video, kurttt, his most popular song, is sitting at over 1.1 million streams on Spotify and 2.2 million views on YouTube on only one of the song's re-uploads. His more popular songs as Grausamkeit, Trollheim and Heroin Makes Happy are all comfortably sitting on several 100,000 listens each. Blod Besvimelse's most popular song, Misanthrope, did even better. After becoming somewhat of a meme as a TikTok audio, it is currently sitting at over 3 million views on YouTube. Browsing through the comments reveals that the reception to Andreas's music has been overwhelmingly positive, with countless people applauding his musical genius and referring to his work as some of the best ever composed. Out of nowhere, Andreas's music was launched into the mainstream. In a few short years, he went from his music being only listened to by him and Sandra to having so many fans that people get called posers for listening to his records. Andreas never compromised on his vision though. In a genre where so many bands toned down their music to make it more palatable to the widest audience possible, he spent a decade making music purely for himself to listen to, with seemingly no attempts to get his work out to the masses. There is something admirable about seeing a man whose whole life revolved around making music authentic to himself succeed, skyrocketing into popularity even beyond bands who have supposedly sold out. It'll be interesting to see where Andreas Bettinger goes from here. Will he be able to leverage the recent success he's received and commit fully to making music, or will his addiction take him back to prison once again? Only time will tell. But whichever of the two paths he ends up going down, one thing is for sure. Whether by pure chance or through genuine musical genius, Andreas went from a heroin addict endlessly recording songs into a 4-track in his bedroom to a name that will be remembered in black metal history as one of the greatest of all time.